For hundreds of years, for the vast majority of people, their origins were never in doubt. God created both men and women, and that was the end of it. But then in the 1800s, this man, Charles Darwin, after spending several months in the Galapagos Islands among some of the most odd creatures on the planet, concluded that humans must have come about through some sort of natural means, and he wrote a book about it called Origin of the Species. With no more to go on than the musings of Mr. Darwin, certain segments of the scientific community fairly leapt onto the Darwinian bandwagon, spawning a new term, evolution, and declaring the theory scientifically sound. Could it be that the human family actually sprang from some ancient form of monkey? Most people rejected the notion outright, and virtually all religions came to the defense of the Bible and its record of creation. The battle continues to this very day, and if anything, has heated up over the years. But with millions and millions of fossils discovered in the past half-century, shouldn't the argument be over? Haven't there been discoveries of man-like creatures? For nearly 150 years, various scientific disciplines have waged a vigorous and unyielding war on the fundamental concepts taught in the book of Genesis. Could it be that today the assumptions of the evolutionists are being questioned not just by creationists, but by other scientists as well? Dr. Arthur C. Custance, a PhD in anthropology, is the author of the 10-volume Doorway Papers. He was a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute and a member of the New York Academy of Sciences.
So basic are these erroneous assumptions that the whole theory is maintained in spite of, rather than because of, the evidence. It has become, in the strictest sense, irrational, yet concepts which challenge the theory are almost never given a fair hearing.
But if the basic tenets of the theory of evolution are so easily dismissed by prominent scientists, how could it be that these ideas and concepts have taken such a firm hold on 20th century thinking? What are we missing here?
One of the reasons the theory of evolution became so popular is the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925. This trial pitted William Jennings Bryan against Clarence Darrow in a classic confrontation regarding the teaching of evolution in schools.
The paradox that happened during the Scopes trial was that the creationist won. The evolutionary teacher, John Scopes, was convicted and fined, but because of the way the media presented it, it looked like they had more information and they were more acceptable than the creationists, who were made to look like they were imbeciles, like they knew nothing about science. And so from that point on, our society began to accept evolution as a valid thought. And that's how we came to where we are today, where it has taken over in the schools, it has taken over in the public for the most part, because of the way the media slanted it way back then in 1925.
Was the Scopes trial the watershed so far as evolution was concerned? Weren't there other findings? Archaeologists have claimed for years that they have been digging up the remains of early versions of man all over the globe. What about Piltdown Man?
The original is locked in a vault someplace under armed guard where nobody ever gets to see that, or very, very rarely.
But certainly the quest continues. What do new discoveries and new studies reveal about early human remains?
It appears that anthropologists have made a concerted effort to adhere to a rigid uniformitarian viewpoint concerning the aging and growth of ancient populations, despite evidence to the contrary. For example, the Gibraltar II child's skull and jaw bones were never allowed to speak for themselves. When we set aside the evolutionary dogma, we find that we have remarkable evidence for a child who matured late and aged slowly, consistent with the long lifespans written about in the Bible.
Could it be that anthropologists, in search of supporting data for the theory of evolution, have actually unearthed data that supports the biblical record? What about the widely publicized find affectionately named Lucy? Where does she fit in the evolutionary scale?
As you know, Lucy was found in 1974, and sometimes I refer to her as the woman who shook up man's family tree, because she represents for us the oldest, most complete skeleton we have of any human ancestor known to anthropologists.
Actually, Lucy was very chimpanzee-like. She stood 3 feet 6 inches tall, had a chimp-sized brain and chimp-like teeth. She was a chimp. The only features that even hint toward human ancestry were her hips and knee joints, and these gave a hint toward erect posture. But even these are very controversial among evolutionists.
She comes closer to representing, I think, what the average person thinks of as the missing link than any other fossil we had ever found in Africa. So she has extraordinary importance in terms of understanding the very earliest phases of human evolution.
Charles Oxnard, a British scientist, is probably the world's leading expert on Lucy. He spent 16 years studying every bone, doing a computer analysis of each, the dimensions of all the bones, and said, folks, it's not a missing link. It's just an unusual monkey.
But haven't there been other fossil discoveries that have gained great notoriety over the years as ancestors of modern man?
Another so-called missing link, Java Man, was concocted by Eugene Dubois when he found an ape-like skull fragment and then 50 feet away a human leg bone. However, just before he died, Dubois confessed that he also found 2 human skulls at the same location.
Prestigious National Geographic magazine in May 2000 headlined an article on new paleontological findings as the dawn of humans. This 2-million-year-old hominid skull, the article says, is the most complete of its kind yet found, a large-jawed proto-human that became extinct on a side branch of the human family tree. We're left to wonder how an extinct species so dissimilar to humans could possibly be evidence of the dawn of humans, or even proto-humans for that matter.
Apparently, the frantic search for missing links has resulted in a number of mistakes and even fraud. Unfortunately, some of those mistakes are still perpetuated today. Java Man, for example, is still referred to in some texts as the beginnings of Homo erectus. But if the fossil record is incomplete or just plain scientifically unsatisfactory, where does that leave us? Where can we look next? Is there an explanation for the gap in the fossil record? Could it be that there was an Adam and Eve, but we've been looking in the wrong place? Is there some kind of evidence for the origins of man in the more modern DNA or genetic sciences? Is it possible that if the missing link cannot be found buried under the Earth's strata, Adam and Eve might be found under the lens of a microscope? Someone once wrote that the formula for evolution was really quite simple. Nothing plus nobody times flying chance equals everything. That was probably said in jest, but in reality, the very serious concept of spontaneous generation is in fact quite similar. This proposition suggests that chemicals plus time equals life, all life. But is either proposition scientifically supportable?
One of the fundamental laws in biology is biogenesis, that life comes only from pre-existing life. Now that's a great encouragement to people who believe in creation, but I began my college teaching career as an evolutionist, convinced that chemicals put together life without any outside help at all. Science has convinced me that just won't work. In fact, death might be defined as the triumph of chemistry over biology. When molecules begin to do what comes naturally for them, the result is death, not life. Chemistry may help us understand how we return to dust. It could never explain how we came from dust in the first place.
A number of scientists have tried to calculate the mathematical probability of life arising by chance. Sir Fred Hoyle, a British mathematician, estimated the mathematical probability of the 2,000 proteins in an amoeba arising by chance. He estimated the probability of that happening to be 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. Clearly a mathematical impossibility.
The probability of 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power is a number so ridiculously small that Sir Frederick Hoyle was forced to conclude that, quote, "it is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence," end quote.
The problem with evolutionism is that it has order coming out of chaos. That simply doesn't happen. Science can produce no parallels. Evolutionism is bad science and bad philosophy.
But if that's the case, Our investigation so far has been fruitless, no pun intended. The Garden of Eden has not been found, and according to a number of scholars in various fields, evolution is untenable. Are these the only possibilities? The story of how the world was created and how mankind came to be is found in the first 2 books of Genesis in the Hebrew Torah, later incorporated into the Bible. These 2 small books had shaped the Judeo-Christian view of the earth and its beginnings for millennia, but by the middle of the 19th century, that view was being challenged. The story is set forth in the simplest of terms. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The 6 stages of creation are then described, concluding with the creation of man, Adam, and from Adam a woman who was called Eve. The Bible doesn't go into a great deal of detail about how everything was created, only that it was done and in a certain number of days. The Bible also makes it clear that all of this was accomplished by a creator, God, who apparently had some grand design and purpose for his creation. For some reason, he chose a man, Adam, and a woman, Eve, to help him accomplish that grand design. But is the story of Adam and Eve literally true?
Many people think that the story of Adam and Eve was a symbolic account or a legend or myth to explain the origin of people. However, the literature of the Bible treats Adam and Eve in the form of writing that is used for historical narratives. Adam and Eve, for example, are included in family trees. The setting in which they are made has real cities, real rivers that we know of from history. Now, if there are people who say, I don't believe it, but the Bible certainly introduces Adam and Eve as historical figures.
The myth of Adam and Eve is not either true or false. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. It's a myth, by which I mean it's a story to explain to the people of that time and that geographical area where they came from and why they're there and so on.
Could it be, as the evolutionists believe, we are here simply because we beat the odds? And if that's the case, how can we account for the gaps in the fossil record? There is now a new conceptualization of the evolutionary process that addresses that problem. It doesn't replace the idea of a primordial soup and all life commencing from nothing, but it does have some interesting implications for the Darwinian concept of natural selection. It's called punctuated equilibria.
In contrast to the slow and gradual form of evolution originally proposed, to cover up the fact that the fossil record didn't fit that form, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard and Niles Eldridge of the American Museum in New York proposed in the early 70s a method or a model of evolution called punctuated equilibria. It suggested vast periods of stasis or equilibrium, no change in the fossil record of individual forms, and then sudden upward changes to a new variety or new species over relatively short periods of time. But that didn't fit the record either, because in either case, transitional forms are needed, and they are not existing.
Even Darwin admitted that his own theory was worthless speculation without the all-important fossil proof of transitional forms.
It was Archaeopteryx, a fossil found in Bavaria that was intermediate in many of its structures between reptiles and birds. A typical reptilian characteristic was the long, bony tail, absent in modern birds, and teeth. The striking feature that made it like a bird was the presence of wings and feathers. Careful study by paleontologists confirmed that Archaeopteryx was almost a perfect intermediate between reptiles and birds. And so, in a very real sense, this was positive proof of the correctness of Darwin's idea of evolution.
The favorite example that my evolutionary colleagues usually give for transitional forms is the creature called Archaeopteryx, and it's supposedly the link between reptiles and birds. But you know, there's been a fossil found here recently of a bird that is 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. So obviously, Archaeopteryx couldn't be the ancestor of birds. Actually, the evidence is such that evolutionists can't agree on how reptiles evolved into birds. And they certainly don't all agree that Archaeopteryx was the ancestor. The transitional forms that they need simply are not there. But that doesn't stop them. You go to any textbook on evolution, and there's Archaeopteryx, as if it were proof that reptiles evolved into birds.
Dr. Stephen J. Gould, professor at Harvard University, and Dr. Niles Eldridge, the curator of the American Museum of Natural History, have developed a notion that, in the simplest terms, suggests that somewhere in the distant past, a lizard laid an egg and a fully developed bird hatched out and flew away. And it happened so fast, the species didn't leave any geologic trace or any evidence of transitional forms. Let me see if I have this right. The reason we cannot see it happening in the fossil record is because it's happening too fast. And the reason why we cannot see it happening in the fossil record today is because it's happening too slow, or possibly it never happened at all.
Punctuated equilibria is hardly the last gasp of evolutionary scientists to understand the changes that we see in organisms through time in the fossil record. Punctuated equilibria allows us to understand gaps in the fossil record. It's one hypothesis among many that helps us to explain change through time.
The theory has been around now for nearly 2 decades and is probably as controversial today within the scientific community as it was when it was first proposed. In the introduction, the authors point out that, quote, our several distinguished biologists are unable to agree on a common definition of the constituent elements of punctuated equilibrium. On the same page, Dr. Anthony Hoffman identifies 3 versions of the theory as entirely trivial, blatantly false, and empirically untestable. Yet the theory does have its supporters.
A new and better understanding of evolution has emerged in recent years, known as punctuated equilibria. And this contrasts a notion of a gradual change over time with the fact that quite frequently in major groups of organisms there is a rapid change in the varieties present, followed by a long period of which there is little or no change.
I think that this whole idea of punctuated equilibrium, it's nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage evolution theory.
Is that true? Are new scientific disciplines and studies blowing holes in evolutionist ideas? Among the best known of these new disciplines are the fairly recent scientific developments in the fields of genetics and DNA. Can their contribution to the argument help resolve the controversy?
One of the more amusing things you hear these days is that the DNA of man and chimpanzees is something like 98% identical. As a geneticist, I can tell you, you're not even that closely related to yourself. The DNA you inherit from your mother, the DNA you inherit from your father are at best about 93% similar. But think for a minute about a cloud. A cloud is 98% water. A watermelon's 98% water. Jellyfish is 98% water. Using the logic of an evolutionist, you'd have to say there's no difference between a watermelon, a cloud, and a jellyfish. Yeah, we know there are big differences. Suppose there were only a 2% difference. If that 2% DNA told the other 98% what to do, wow, what a difference there would be. In fact, we're so special that each one of us has our own unique DNA fingerprint.
As a practical matter, we can say that neither the human nor the chimp DNA has been anywhere near fully sequenced, so a proper comparison can hardly be made. But have DNA studies yielded any results in the scientific quest to discover the real Adam and Eve?
The data on DNA has been very helpful in showing that all people came from one woman we might call Eve, but the date has always been controversial. Back in 1987, a group out at Berkeley suggested that the differences may have arisen over 100 to 200,000 years. But more recently, scientists have discovered that DNA in mitochondria changes about 20 times faster than previously assumed. In 1998, a study was done that showed that changes in mitochondrial DNA occur more than 20 times faster than previously assumed. It now looks as if Eve may have lived just 6,000 years ago.
And what about Adam? Are there any genetic clues?
When we look at the DNA of mitochondria, we can trace our female ancestor all back to one woman called mitochondrial Eve. Well, scientists said, let's try it with the father. We can take the Y chromosome, which men have and women don't, and sure enough, we all come from one father, and it's common to call that first father Adam. But here's the problem. Originally, when they did the dates for the first woman and the first man, they were about 100,000 years apart. Now, talk about sitting around on a Saturday night waiting for the phone to ring. That doesn't look like that would really work. Fortunately, new evidence has brought those dates much closer to the present time. Well-known evolutionist at Berkeley once said that it looks like there are very few differences among human beings. As he put it, we all got off the same boat not so very long ago. I think he may have said a lot more than he really intended.
At the moment, only one thing seems certain. The argument between creationists and evolutionists is far from over, and neither side shows any signs of retreating from their position. Still, the pendulum of knowledge and understanding is never at rest, and for the moment at least, it seems to be swinging back toward an interpretation compatible with the Genesis account. Perhaps the renowned modern astronomer Robert Jastrow had it right after all when he said, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries."